Absolutely.
Cool. All right. Welcome to the Daily Archetype. I'm Isaac J. Miller, and I'm with a couple guys to talk about Sapiens and what is the big deal about humans. Uh, Yuval Noah Harari calls us Sapiens, and he makes the distinction early on why he does that. And that's because are not, we were not the only human species originally, but Sapiens were one species of at least five or six that were probably originally in existence. So that's why to be scientifically and historically accurate, Yuval Noah Harari in the book that we'll be chatting about here, he calls us sapiens, and that's the main uh, subject matter. And we're going to do a little sort of like book club chat on part one, which is basically covering prehistorical history, the times of what he calls the cognitive revolution, which is a little strange because it covers pre 70,000 years ago, roughly, and then approximately that time, and that time up until the agricultural revolution, which is the other part of the part two of the book, and it's in four parts. There's also the unification of humankind and the modern revolution. Anyway, there's four parts that we'll cover in four different little meetings with the maybe these guys and some other guys. So before we dive into all this exciting historical stuff, Goncalo, your mic's already on. So tell us a little bit about you and maybe some first impressions on chapters 1, 2, 3, 4, or just in general.
Okay, about me, I don't know.
I heard you're gonna start a podcast. Is that right? Is it gonna be?
I'm thinking about it.
Is it gonna be in Portuguese? That's the big question everyone's starting to know.
No, I don't think so.
Okay, reach out to your English fans.
Yeah.
Okay.
But
the nice thing about Zoom now is you can take translation and all the other stuff, transcripts, right? So you could do it in multi-languages almost.
Yeah, I should probably be doing that too. Get out to all the people in Portugal and all the languages around the world that really want to know about our stuff. So yeah, you're a engineering student that's probably switching to another field, and
yes.
you read. Have you finished the book yet, or you just read
I
most
finished
of it?
Like 3 weeks ago or something.
Okay.
I kind of review it a little bit today. Mm-hmm. My book is in Portuguese, and so it's interesting. Some of the examples are about Portugal, about like the Homo sapiens and the other species, Homo species are. Examples are in Portugal, which is different, I'm sure. But I guess the book is the same. I think it was a very interesting book, of course.
Right.
I don't know.
Cool. That's a good introduction. And Josh, the guy who is a few weeks away from defending his PhD dissertation, what's up with you and stuff?
Yeah, I'm Joshua Barrow. I'm a grad student here at University of Tennessee, Knoxville in physics, and hopefully will defend my PhD in less than 2 months. So I'm here taking a little breather before I get back to writing. Mm-hmm. And I guess first impressions, I had read this a long time ago. Harari, of course, is a great public speaker, great writer, very simple, easy to access, but also, of course, has a lot of complexity there, which is important. And just in reviewing the first few chapters, I will say I did not get through all four again.
That's fine.
The thing that I found most interesting was just how, I guess you could call it banal it all seemed. He was very focused on just the objective aspects of our initial cultural developments, which I think is actually a little bit refreshing. And he kind of directly mentions that we don't typically think of ourselves that way. We usually think of ourselves as this kind of illuminating light going backward and how smart we were and all these things. And it was good to kind of bring us down to earth a little bit and back into context from our lofty perspective that we now have. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, it's real interesting, and what he does get into, especially in these chapters, that is particularly interesting. And again, these are tough because they're basically going back to prehistory, sort of in a theoretical way, only being able to go off of artifacts and carbon dating and cave wall paintings and those kind of things, and bones, probably lots of bones that were studied. Some DNA now, and lots of frozen poop and fossil poop. So they've been putting together these theories of what prehistory history was and made a lot of progress. And what he's getting at, though, is, especially in these chapters, and especially I think it was chapter 2, the tree of knowledge, he calls it, which was what made the cognitive revolution. I believe, said that was something like a, some people even call it, or at least he does it, like a tree of knowledge gene, because somewhere about 70,000 years ago, we became, or human beings, sapiens, became more intelligent to the degree that we could communicate better and be able to operate in larger and larger groups like no other animal could do. One thing is, he kind of seems to, some people will say, because a lot of what he's saying in these early chapters is saying like what separates humans from the rest of nature or the rest of the world. And a lot of what he does is he focuses on our language, and especially our ability to create fictions, he calls them often, because that can unify us in bigger and bigger numbers. And we see that more and more these days as the world gets more and more big and connected. And I think he kind of downplays what a lot of people say sets us apart, which was our tool making ability. And I think it's really both. One, and maybe it's tough to put down the time frame, but it's the tool making ability. It's basically like our engineering ability. So we engineered tools out of nature and things within nature, like how to. Because he made the point of how, what was it? Like he had a long story about Peugeot, the story of Peugeot, which is this European automaker. And it's funny because he seems to select
Peugeot. Sorry.
Yeah, I think I was listening to
say Peugeot.
Yeah, depends. Like I think there was a British guy reading my Audible, and he might have pronounced it Peugeot or something in between. But anyway, it's a British automaker, or French, actually, European. And I made the point that this was not far from this cave. I just forgot the name of the lion or the area, but this lion was a one of the earliest artifacts where it looks like
the Stadel cave.
There you go. Yes, exactly. The Stadel cave, or Stadel lion, where they found this earliest artifact of something that seemed like some type of religion element, or some type of faith in a unhuman element, which was that they seem to have
something anthropomorphized.
Right. Yeah. They deified this artifact, and he made the point that goes all the way back in history, that we're always doing some sort of deification or building these fictions around our stories that connect us. And he said the advantage of that is that helps us to work in larger and larger groups. Sometimes he'll make the point of how if you put a human one-on-one versus most animal in most competitions, like a fight or a run, or those type of things, then the human will lose. But as you get more and more human versus animal, so like you could have like 1,000 humans versus 1,000 apes or gorillas or whatever, then we might win. But when it's 100 versus 100, we would probably lose in some type of a competition of human versus ape. But because we can communicate better and better in bigger groups, and again, this is where I think that we do need to give some kind of to our tool making ability too, because at that point it also works because we can make tools. Anyway, so all this is to say that then he gets into what reality is, which is the big thing with him, is that he sort of redefines reality for us, or maybe like better defines reality for us by saying we treat corporations and countries as real things, and sometimes at the cost of real things like rivers and lions and such. So what are some of your guys' initial thoughts on my initial thoughts?
Well, I love the Lion Man because it proves that furries are, you know, just as old as time.
Mm-hmm.
So for all those fetishists out there, you have people among you.
There you go.
But I think that the thing that I drew a similarity to, I thought, was that I think it's somewhat easier for us to idealize things, idealize people, idealize deities, etc., which are easier for us to connect with because they are ideals. They are something that's ethereal to us in some respect. It's
Right.
much easier for us to see paths forward for ourselves in comparison to those things from our own subjective perspectives, rather than comparisons to our fellow better in shape or better looking or faster or smarter village compatriot. So I think it also kind of speaks to the ability for many of us, even in our adult years, to get so much out of things like animation, as far as entertainment and philosophical value is concerned, just because it's easy for us to kind of project onto those images, onto those kind of vestiges of our own subconscious.
Right.
So the fact that you have this just kind of orgasm all of a sudden and around 30,000 years ago of like all of these cave paintings and all of these glyphs and artistic creations, I think was interesting, because we kind of seemed to suddenly tap into something that we hadn't really had access to. And being able to foster connections with people through those ideals, those images, could be done beyond the kind of subjective self, which I thought was interesting, because we're both agreeing on the composition of this thing. We're both agreeing that this is our image or something that we're worshiping together. And that's interesting because it tells you you require probably words to even describe those things, but now you're also going beyond that into the abstraction of it.
Yeah. So again, he starts getting into just like what reality is, and that's important because and it's something we talk a lot about in the daily archetype. In fact, I got into a short little conversation in the group about that earlier as I was sort of preparing for this, because it's like sometimes I think of, he's kind of like making a case in this chapter, or these initial chapters, of like these things are fictions, and sometimes I don't know, it's he likes that word fictions, but it's like then that gets into again of like what is real and what's not real. So we might also call it just like agreements that we have, or things that people put faith in, or people that things that people find use in, because
narratives for ease of communication,
right, that unite us. In fact, I was just thinking too how whether we believe the story is true or not, or whatever. Like the Bible story of the Tower of Babel really works in how that humankind, when in the story they were so unified, they were trying to build this tower up to deify themselves, and then God in the story struck down the tower, and so they wouldn't do that again, he divided their languages. So it's really the language can unify more and more people, and that's on every level, just like not just like English versus Portuguese or Japanese or whatever, but also the language of like people being maybe woke versus red pill, or all these different ways of looking at the world. Or Josh works in what, elementary particles, is that what you call your field? So there's a language that goes with that.
Sure, elementary particle physics.
Yeah. So there's a language that goes with that you deal with, and you try to sometimes put it in a language that a lay person could understand. So language is ultimately a unifying factor, that as we become more and more speaking the same language, we can more and more unify. But what also matters too is meaning and impact. So in other words, if the because meaning or purpose, in that if it's being used to a specific end, like survival and make people more fit, more adapted, then that's a meaning. And then if the impacts for that meaning, or the opposite, and makes people die or kill each other or lose their minds, those type of things. And he puts these things in a lot of what a story is, and that stories are what unite, and that's sort of like what belief systems are too. And a lot of it too gets into the theoretical aspect. But Goncalo, what's your take?
Okay, when you were talking about fiction, what came into my mind is that like monkeys,
right,
can also like lie. They can also,
yeah. You gave that example.
Yeah, so they also have some fiction in their brain, right?
Mm-hmm.
But it's the degree of fiction that they can produce changes completely the game, like the meta or whatever.
Have you heard the story of the experiments of the shower heads and the groups of monkeys with the bowl of fruit?
No.
So I think this was in the 70s, I want to say. And Goncalo, I'm sorry, I'll let you get back to it. But there's this experiment done, I believe it was in the 70s, where they had a group of, I want to say it was like 9 or 10 monkeys. I believe they were just chimpanzees. And they had a pedestal, and above that pedestal was a shower head that had like very high pressure cold water, and then there was on top of this pedestal a bowl of fruit. And of course, you put all of the monkeys into the room, they see the fruit, they start climbing the pedestal, and then they get showered with this cold, very painful water, right? And the interesting thing is that, of course, after they experience this for a number of iterations, they all just don't go after the food anymore. They don't go after the fruit.
Mm-hmm.
Then they started switching out the monkeys one by one. And every time that a new monkey would come in, they would try climbing it, and then everybody would grab the monkey. Everybody would grab the other monkey who was trying to climb up, and they'd try to pull them down because they didn't want them to experience that pain. The interesting thing was that after they had done this enough and they had switched out all of the original monkeys so that none of the original monkeys were still around, they were still pulling people down. They were still pulling other monkeys down off of the pedestal.
It's like a handed down belief.
It's a culture.
Yeah.
It's an outgrowth of that. But anyway, so it was fictional, but it was also a useful fiction, even though it was something that no one had ever experienced. So anyway, Goncalo, back to your point.
Yeah. I guess that was my point, but I want to say like something that I've heard from Jordan Peterson, which is functional truths, which is like religion. It's not true, but it teaches you parts of reality, like what you were saying about
like values,
the Babel Tower.
yeah.
Values also. We're saying that when we all speak the same and understand each other, we can grow, whatever. What you have to say about that?
So this gets into more and more issues of reality, and I just wrote something down. What was it? That he makes the correlation too of, and I mentioned this, but how like corporations and countries are just like agreed upon things, but they affect reality just as much or more so than like a river or a lion, for example, as some of the examples that he used. And this is true, especially nowadays when we look at certain things as so important, like having consistent power grids and sewage systems and everything, and those need to be operated by these coalitions or some type of corporation, even if it's a public works corporation. Those need to be operable. And then same thing with things like he'd give examples of like the car company, even Google. It's not real the same way that a river or a tree is real, but it's real in that it affects our reality and helps us to sometimes live better, you might say, and sometimes some of these things that are made into reality affect our lives in unforeseen ways. Just like oftentimes people will give the example of how, like, if Steve Jobs knew what would happen with the way that people would use the iPhone, he might not have done it, or at least maybe would do it in a different way because it's not being used the way that he was really intending it exactly. Same thing with so many things that are created, especially now with the internet and apps and everything on our technology that are constantly being made and then used in ways that aren't necessarily intended. Same thing with things like at the elementary particle level, as we've gotten into things that happen with nuclear bombs and nuclear power. Some of that maybe saved us from Hitler, maybe not. And then some of it led to other unforeseen consequences in the Cold War and other such things. And some of it gave the debatable if nuclear power is good or not. So these kind of things, they are real, and we manipulate our realities based on them. And like I said, I look at reality like in a gradient, sort of like in COVID, maybe a year or two. So like we'll say COVID, for example. This is just saying what reality is. So maybe 2 or 3 years ago, COVID was something in horseshoe bats. And then at some point in 2019, the reason it's called COVID-19 is it made at least theoretically, we haven't figured this out exactly, it made the leap into a human airborne virus and everything. And then in 2019, it was somewhat isolated in China. And so over time, physically, that reality became more real, but then also it affected the reality of how that we do so many things, like have Zoom meetings rather than meet in person, and everything else that we're dealing with, wearing masks, not being able to go certain places that we used to, not being able to travel certain places that we used to, because certain things, as they come into reality, they affect reality in the ways that we would like, and then other things affect things in reality the way that we don't like. Just like he gave the example of rivers and lions. Well, we will move lions certain places, and sometimes we'll stop up rivers, or we will create new rivers or bodies of water. So like I said, a lot of this is getting into what reality is, and it's kind of like the foundation of so many things as we get into the stages of history here. So I don't know if that answers anybody's question.
I guess the thing that I'm pretty sure he is a supporter of in some respect is just generalized scientific inquiry, although he hasn't gotten there yet, of course. But the more capable we are scientifically in understanding the natural world and understanding ourselves at multiple levels of abstraction or complexity, the better we're going to be able to understand whatever it is that's out there that could in the future harm us, help us, etc.
Well, and this is something I think I wanted to get your perspective on, Josh, is that, and sometimes I think even Carl Jung made reference to this in how that we look at the mind, but we can sometimes compare it to what we do on the elementary particle level, because certain things at the subatomic level cannot be observed, or if we observe them, it changes the way that they act. And so, but the only way that we can sort of know anything about them is by studying statistical probabilities. So same thing with so many things that we do, just like trying to deal with our behavior in COVID. We don't know exactly the behavior to do that will save the most lives and destroy the least lives, but we try to get it within a statistical probability. And the same thing with so many things in the way that we behave in the world. So I don't know, how does that work in terms of on the elementary particle level, as you might compare it to other types of reality that you can't really see it per se, but you have to observe it within statistical probabilities?
Well, I mean, there are plenty of examples of things that behave in a statistically probable way. I mean, you don't think of it, but you at a stoplight, the amount of time that you spend stopped at a stoplight is a probability distribution.
Right.
It's called a Poissonian. The amount of the way that the way that we usually estimate some kinds of error in even non-particle physics scenarios is using what's called a Gaussian distribution. And we can look at like the noise, the arbitrary fluctuations in the electrical signal of like a microphone, for instance. Those are Gaussian distributed. That's statistical. So I don't find it particularly surprising that at various levels of our reality, whatever the level of abstraction or scale may be, that we have things that appear to be statistical in their at least their outcomes, if not their origins. I mean, the same thing you can say about the transfer of heat, the way that thermodynamics works. This is entirely statistical.
Right.
It's a classical theory, but it has origins in quantum behavior, but you can do all of that. The point I would say, though, is that at least at it's a common misconception within quantum mechanics that the equations that govern quantum behavior are not deterministic. This is a common misconception. There is no technical problem in the equations of quantum mechanics that we think of as like, oh no, I don't understand something fundamentally about these equations. The equations behave exactly the same way that they do for a macroscopic object. The trouble comes when you make the object incredibly small. And then it becomes difficult at those very small scales to ascertain certain kinds of observables, measure certain things simultaneously. That's really the only problem. but this is something that still is pervasive in our everyday lives. If you've ever gone to the beach and you've seen waves come in, if I asked you to locate where that wave was precisely, you wouldn't be able to do it. You would be able to do it plus or minus half of a wavelength, but that's just a characteristic of the wave.
Yeah, and so many things like this, and this relates to just like the development of history, and the development, in these of humanity, and these things that we talk about, where it's similar to that like wave in the ocean idea of like, what is that wave? And you could say that maybe it came from miles out and miles down on some level, but also it's there because of the gravity of the moon and so many other things. So all these forces that are at play, whether that's a number of gravitational forces, a number of forces including the wind and jet streams and Gulf streams, will make up what is like just that wave that looked like it just was like right there. So likewise in what we call humanity, in that it's never just one thing that makes us what we are in our behavior or our reality. It's all these things that weave together, and
the interactions between them and
Right.
our interactions with them.
Right.
So there was a beautiful part of the first chapter
Yeah.
that he talked about where he was talking effectively about the morphology of humans, right? And how there were many different morphologies across the genus Homo. Some were very small, some were very large, etc. But this is a point that goes back to, if you read Maps of Meaning with Peterson, all of these things, the evolutionary history of the evolutionary tree, there's constant optimizations and different kind of branches that are going and being explored morphologically, genetically speaking, etc. And there's consistent optimizations through mutation, etc., that you can't even conceive of without them happening, right? Like the idea that the development of the human eye or nose or extended thumbs, etc., you can't even consider behaviors without those things kinds of existing beforehand in some respect. Like you couldn't have conceived of being able to differentiate burned food versus fresh food versus rotting food if you'd never had a nose, if there had never been an evolutionary part that led to that development. So there's interesting kind of interactions between whatever is actually out there, which we can call reality, and the way that we are processing that within our own
which is another form of reality.
Yeah, because our subjective experience is not necessarily the same, and it's not necessarily the same from a natural selective experience, whatever you want to, whatever the mediating thing is that mediates that natural selection process.
Yeah, it's all real, and then that's why I say it's such a big thing of what made us humans and what made history. Another correlation between this and Maps of Meaning that Harari and Peterson both mention, I forget exactly how they worded it, but basically, a lot of times, including Harari here, said that there was probably a random mutation somewhere about 70,000 years ago, but maybe there was, but one, it could have been from how that the different species of humans were able to breed together, because they sometimes at first they were thinking they couldn't interbreed, whether they would have offspring and then that offspring could not then breed because it'd be sterile, almost like a donkey and a horse can make a mule, but then that mule can't then go on and make babies with anything else. So likewise, it could have been something with the breeding perhaps of the different species, because we are not pure sapien actually. there's like a small percentage of Denisovan DNA in us and Neanderthal DNA in us. So something along those lines. But the other aspect that they both mention in Maps of Meaning and this one is that basically we traded our digestive system for brain power, because brain power takes a lot of energy. Like something like 25% of our caloric burn is in the human being is through our neurological structure, which is really high compared to other animals. And the reason we're able to do that is because, and this is why it happened about the same time in history, because somewhere around 70,000-ish years ago is when we started mastering fire, and then we started to cook things, and so then we could cook more meats and vegetables and everything else to more easily get the nutrients out of them that otherwise would have just not been digested. Like apes just
this time saving, opens the whole arc of history of higher brain development,
right.
larger brain development, eventually of having time for things like agriculture, and eventually art, and all of these things happen,
and tool making
and tool making. Yeah, because you definitely have to have tools for the hunt, right? But then there's extensions of that you can of course conceive of as far as agriculture, art making, etc.
Right. So it's like
so that's the other abstraction, right? We're no longer just manipulating from kind of switching from after mastering fire, and then changing our biological morphology, our brain structure, our intestinal structure, etc. We then suddenly found a way to go beyond our morphology and create something entirely new, right? Where we're extending our morphology.
Right.
And that's a kind of impressive thing.
Yeah, because some of it is saying, like, sometimes it's easy to just be like, oh, there must have been a random mutation there. And maybe that could be the case in certain cases, but like a lot of it, at least to the degree of figuring out why humans are so much more, smarter than other animals, is what we're able to do with food in most cases, being able to cook it and in some cases preserve it.
Well, remember, there's it's not just the random mutation part. It's also the random mutation in conjunction with different environmental, social, cultural pressures, right? So this is just imagine a world with no caves and where it rained all the time. Would you expect, if somehow previously the genus Homo had arisen, I wouldn't expect necessarily them to discover fire. Okay, because the wood, if it exists, is always waterlogged, etc. So, if the conditions of the planet had been different, you could easily conceive of a different future for those species.
Theoretically.
So, just ignoring all of the other inconsistencies there, but think like when I remember watching Star Wars and the Clone Wars, or not the Clone Wars, Attack of the Clones,
right?
And the cloners, I can't remember what the name of them are, but they're on a water planet, right?
Yeah.
And like the whole thing is just water. And then there are these structures that are like suspended in the ocean, and then they're producing all these clones for the Republic.
Yeah.
And I always looked at that, I was like, that makes absolutely no fucking sense. Because how in the world would you have the genesis of a species on a water planet that was raining all the time, and then all of a sudden they're like, what do we need? We need dry land. No, you're a fish in the sea. You don't know that you are in the middle of it. Like
yeah, but theoretically, if this happened over time, so I don't know if we know more about the history of this random
I don't remember
fantasy planet, but
there's probably some novel somewhere.
Probably, but basically, if it's almost like Waterworld, there's shows that think about like, oh, what if in however many hundred or whatever years that there's like no more dry land and we have to build structures above the water and then through the water or whatever else. So it'd be the same thing. So there, I solved your inconsistency of Star Wars theory. And so much of human history is that way, that we adapt. Like I had a discussion the other day about that quote that I guess is misrepresented or paraphrased. And I'll just paraphrase the paraphrase that Darwin said: it's not the smartest or the strongest that survive, but that which can adapt to change the best. Or that's, again, that's a paraphrase, but and it's a paraphrase of a paraphrase, by the way, and that's why it's a little bit debated from over the years, because it's basically taken out of like a textbook, kind of summarizing parts of origins of species. So it's about adaptability. So some of these things might have just happened all at once, where we've got new things in our genes, and then therefore that helps. But then some of it is like over time. So in other words, like if all of a sudden we could, like, if hypothetically we could teach monkeys how to cook, or I don't know. There's ways that you can think of how you might theorize that, and or like if you took, I don't know, like I wonder if you could even try to look at generations and generations of some type of animal, maybe monkeys or some other type, where you don't feed them, instead of them in the wild gathering leaves and such all day, you actually feed them. Like, here's your food already cooked, and now what are you gonna do? And then if that then I guess over time that would probably change their genetics, and supposedly that's what happened to the human species, is over time, as we were able to eat the food that we'd prepared differently. And the other theory, by the way, and this goes into the tool making thing, is that we may have had tools to get into the bone marrow of certain animals, because we didn't have the ability to fight off certain animals. But after all the animals would go through and destroy a carcass, however many thousands of years ago or tens of thousands of years ago, we may have figured out tools that would just take the bones away and break out the marrow that was in the middle. Is another thing that started helping us to be set apart from animals, theoretically. Goncalo, what do you think?
Yeah, I was thinking that I've heard also about that the brain has developed, the human brain has developed more because we are bipedal, and that I guess it's harder on our brain for balance, whatever. Then our hands are not on the ground with such. Our hands become more fine or whatever, so we can
fine motor skills.
Yeah, we can deal with smaller objects, and also that maybe also helps us make tools and
like when they map out our neurons, I forget off the top of my head, but you've got a lot in your face and tongue, and then after your head, it's, other than some that passes through the spine, you've got a lot in your hands. And so, and not all animals are that way. We of course have the most neurons and feelers in our hands compared to other animals. Because if you look at other animals, however, to whatever level that they are bipedal or not, there's an intelligence aspect. Like, even if you look at like dogs trying to play with things or interact with us, they'll use their front feet, front paws, whatever. And that's something that over time, the more that we would do that, it would develop skills. Just like, even if you look at IQ has risen a lot in the past, in the modern or postmodern era. And it's not necessarily because of dexterity now, it's because it's not even necessarily because of what we think of in terms of traditional education. It's because we're constantly having to deal with like little puzzles, like even just puzzles of like street signs and subway signs, and little puzzles on all these various levels just to operate in the world. So that aspect in the last just few generations, the last few hundred years, has dramatically increased their IQ. Also, just with
to be clear, the nutrition is a major factor there.
Yeah. It is, but it's both, and the nutrition might actually be more. And there's other aspects too, just like how much that we have to be anxious about our livelihood and shelter. So even if you had people that have a lot of food, so basically it's like once a person is like, I can get food and get it into my body easily without putting a lot of like, not just thought, but worry and anxiety into it, then that frees up worry and anxiety and brain power to do other things. And then same thing with their shelter. Once that people know, okay, well, if I just do these things, I can pay rent or whatever it takes to have a shelter.
There's a reason that every great 17th century scientist had no need to work.
Right. Yeah. There's often those stories of like what, not just, the 17th century scientists, they would have their patrons and be sponsored by the state and other
or were independently wealthy, or were priests, or we're not beholden to the normal rigors of everyday existence back then.
Yeah, and it's funny, a lot of people don't realize that Carl Jung, for example, who we talk about a lot, his family was a family of like preachers and things. They were like only moderately successful for the time. So they were not rich, but he married into money. his wife's, Emma Young's family is still well, at least, and that's funny. I don't know I forget that it's like Rothensbaum or something that she was originally, something like that. But that family is still one of the richest family in Switzerland, especially that corporation. It's called International Watch Company or something. But they were like one of the original Swiss watch manufacturers and Swiss clock manufacturers, and at a luxury level at that point. So him having, and that's how he was able to go through his whole midlife crisis the way that he did. Most people have to just like they'll go through that and they have to ignore it and get back to work or get back to dealing with their family. But he had the support of his his wealthy family that he married into. And the strange thing about that is like, okay, nowadays sometimes that'll happen and then they'll realize the guy is kind of taking advantage of that and divorce him or whatever. Or he had at least two different mistresses.
Are you talking about Kim Ye? What are you talking about?
Oh, I'm just talking about in general. But like he had two different mistresses at least. And that was kind of the culture at the time, is that sometimes people would have mistresses. But you can find that throughout history that certain smarter people would, and there's an aspect of this in our on our mental level, that sometimes certain people, they learn to whatever it takes to just be at peace with what that they have, whether they are a monk just on a mountain somewhere or whatever. And then other people, they're just so anxious about their livelihood, even if they're millionaires, that they figure out how to do one thing, but that's all that they can do. So so much is about learning how to worry about the right things at the right time. Like sometimes you need to be worried about making your rent or whatever, and sometimes you need to be worried about or not worry about that, and be more constructive for other things. So yeah, that's a part of how, well, and this gets into later parts of the book, by the way, in the probably unification of mankind, and even in the agricultural revolution and the modern revolution. What do you think, Goncalo?
Okay, I had some ideas to discuss. Yeah. I don't know if you want to go chapter by chapter.
Whatever works for you.
Okay, so we can try that. The first chapter talks about the sapien being a dictator in the savannah, a violent being, and I would say that that's not necessarily like it's nature for like forever or whatever. It's because he has been the underdog, and now that he's the top dog, he has some behaviors that is not balanced, I guess.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah. It's kind of like a maladaptive behavior because something quickly compared to the rest of time ascended to the top of the hierarchy. And yeah, he talks a lot about hierarchies too, how that hierarchies were always at play. And again, another sort of analogous thing with maps of meaning and Jordan Peterson is that hierarchies have always been this reality in the animal world and what became the human world and in nature. And so that's something that we have to deal with. And yeah, I guess he made the point in chapter 1 that we had become sort of dictators on top of the in our dominance, but now I guess we're kind of learning how to like coexist in a better ecosystem type of thing. He makes those points a couple times. Oh, you muted yourself. Looked like.
Yeah. Okay. I thought you were going to say like something more.
Oh no, go ahead.
Deep or whatever. Okay. I had something that I didn't truly understand, which is the second chapter. It talks about the tree of knowledge.
Yeah.
And what is this tree? Is a collection of wisdoms, or what is this? What do you think?
Well, that's kind of what we were talking about a little bit here for most of this, which is the theory of what, because is it? I think it was chapter 1. Do I have it for me? Well, yeah. So chapter 1 is an animal of no significance. So at first we're just basically like everything else, like all the other animals on the food chain, roughly speaking. But it's that tree of knowledge, and some people theorize that there was a genetic component to it, and that's kind of like I said, we've been talking about that for a few minutes, and that some of it would happen environmentally and dietarily over time, and what that we do to ascend ourselves up, and so there's a genetic component to it, an environment component, and a lot of others. So, and some people are just want to be like, it's the tree of knowledge gene, but it's not that simple. That's one component to what made us super smart compared to the other creatures and be able to communicate in these large numbers and everything.
I mean, the thing I took away from it was that it's kind of a representation both of the kind of the time how am I going to say this? The extension and the propagation of ideas through time as kind of a branching of different iterations, right? So if you have a interaction within a lineage, within a village, within a breeding group, and you cross paths with other groups, you may make war, you may make trade, you may make marry, religious rites, etc. All of these are exchanges that are going to lead to something new down the line. But then there's, of course, this other component, which is the morphological, biological, genetic, behavioral component, psychological component that's going to affect each new iteration, right? So there's this backward looking connection.
Yeah, because so many things weave us together for what we are. And like I was saying, we kind of have to rethink what a tool is, because when we, like, some of the earliest tools were the hand axes, and those were really important.
John Vervaeke would rather them be called technologies.
Sure. Well, we can call them I think,
or
I don't,
psychotechnologies.
Yeah, well, and I forget it might have even been like in that little debate that Vervaeke and Peterson had, where he brought up the point, or maybe Peterson talked about it separately, that sometimes we call them affordances. And I think there's another writer who wrote a book on this similar stuff, where he calls them affordances, which actually kind of makes sense, because because it's like that when we see a cliff, we don't think like a cliff is this like pile of matter and rock and subatomic particles and all those things. We think of and it's like unconscious for the most part, but we see cliff and we just our bodies and everything reacts not to like what it is on its physical component level, but just falling off point is because the affordance of that cliff is falling off point. And in the fact that gets into some of the hunting and slaughtering that humans look like that they've done, where they would take these herds of animals and somehow direct these herds to basically run off of cliffs, and then they could harvest these dozens or hundreds of animals sometimes, because that they would have fallen off this cliff. And so it's about affordances, but you could say tools or technologies, but sometimes and affordances or technologies might work better than tools, because the ultimate of these is the human mind. It can be your biggest obstacle or your biggest affordance, or your biggest help. And that's why, like, if people call each other dumb, like sometimes you'll be like, you're dumb, that's stupid. Sometimes we're like overly sensitive of that, and it's not because it matters, quote unquote. It's because deep down we want to know if we are okay or dumb. And in our probably in our history, we're constantly telling people when they're dumb, because you need to know when you're dumb so you don't keep being dumb and doing dumb things. But it hurts the person's ego.
But you don't want to drive them over the edge.
Yeah, you don't want to drive them over a cliff. So, and that's like the whole reality thing I was talking about earlier, is where it's like what a person or what a thing is how much that it kind of like, almost like the COVID example, as it using, as it became more into our conscious reality. Same thing with anything. It's like how much that impacts, how much it impacts reality, and specifically how much it impacts reality for an intended meaning. Just like some of these, like the one of those conversations I was having like that on Facebook, it was because of like people were talking about like what wokeness is, and I said it's like has become like a false religion, and which kind of ties into some of this, because that sort of false religion aspect that it has become, although it may have all had originally all good intentions, it's like ruining Star Wars, and people are losing their jobs over it. All these things where that wasn't the original intended thing. And so a lot of times things will start with one intention and it will become something else over time. It looks like both of you guys have something to say. You guys don't have to keep your mics muted. You can just jump in.
Go ahead, Goncalo, if you have something.
No, I don't.
Okay, go ahead, Josh.
I think it's kind of emblematic of just evolution in general, right? Because we like to, from our lofty current positions, we like to think of all of our developments as having some kind of narrative that runs through them that's consistent and has elevated us through time and made us more part of the good and whatever. But this is a pretty, I guess, subjective, if not kind of novel notion. It's not something that's necessarily objective. So I think you have to remind yourself both of the evolutionary trajectory, the cultural trajectory, all the different kinds of evolutionary things that can happen, whether it be individual or collective, social, psychological, whatever, that they will eventually, these mimetic things will kind of get divorced from their initial intention, right? So that harkens back to the example I gave about the chimpanzees and the cold shower and the fruit. We've lost eventually the memory of the origin of the behavior has been lost.
Right.
That doesn't mean that the behavior is necessarily illegitimate. It just means it's not understood in the same context that it once was.
Well, and it's lost its meaning. So that's why sometimes I say,
but it hasn't lost its truth.
Well, meaning and purpose is about its intended end. So like in your monkey example, probably they always had the fruit there for a temptation, but so like the truth would be like that fruit might be delicious, but not compared to the pain and maybe even that.
But they've never even experienced the pain. They had no mode of even expressing what the pain was like. They had no language. They had no, it was just the behavior of pulling people down and preventing anything from happening.
Yeah, so it's almost like one of the biggest things that we deal with now, and like even Connor, who was on last time we had this type of chat, who will often make this distinction that the vacuum that kind of or like when you take out religion, the vacuum then pulls in its replacement, which is tribalism, and which kind of makes sense in the fact that tribalism is like it's a form of religion, but then basically or it's similar in its behavior, but basically
it's a form of belonging.
Yeah. So basically, instead of using religious belonging in tribalism, you replace it with something else. So some of that could be this wokeness that we talk about sometimes, or even red pillness can go too far in its other ways, and all the political parties and all the corporations and all the countries that don't really exist, even as Harari would put forth. We tribally identify with them, and if it's not them, sometimes it's even like anti that. Like when I think before we started actually recording, we were talking about a little bit about like matter and antimatter, and quarks and anti-quarks, and all these things that need their opposite. Same thing with like America is sometimes a little bit too nationalistic, and then you've got all the people who are then anti-nationalistic, like we need to have open borders and all these things, and the reality is we have both those sides to all this human behavior, because just like in nature, then the reality happens in the middle, where we shouldn't be overly nationalistic or overly anti-nationalistic, but something in the middle. And then like that's a pattern in nature too.
Yeah, to quote Eric Weinstein, it'd be most people are xenophilic restrictionists.
Okay.
Which is just a beautiful construction. But I think that through most of history, we have thought in terms of duals, because it's probably the easiest thing for us to conceive of. But as we have aggregated more and more into nations, governments, cities, etc., you begin to understand that the duals are really just the extremes of a spectrum in some respect, and that spectrum isn't necessarily uniform, right? It's there's peaks and valleys, there's overabundances here and there, depending on backgrounds and origins and all these things of whatever it is that you want to measure, whether it be political view, cultural practices, religious rites, etc. All of those different things that we've kind of incorporated into our identities are all around now. So we as we aggregate, we have to deal with more and more of this complexity, and we have to learn to tolerate it, etc., depending on our views, of course. But that same kind of aggregation was not necessarily present before, because you did have a lower number of people. I can't remember what the number is called. It has a name. It's like 150 people.
Yeah.
And that's an interesting number from a sociological perspective, because it is something that you can maintain personal relationships at that particular number.
Yeah. So basically, at 100 to 150 people, you can know everything about everything, every not just know all the people in that group, but you can also know how that they're related to each other. But once it starts getting above that threshold, then it's like the people, because then it's like everyone has to behave in a certain way because they can't get away with anything, basically. But once it gets over these certain thresholds, then people, the groups start falling apart. So then they faction off into smaller groups that then have to separate. But
so yeah, the miracle that we were able to achieve somehow was some form of tolerance, right? Was that if we could outsource a lot of our responsibility, where we could, for instance, I don't know, have a government hire someone to do something, the miracles of capitalism, that we don't have to necessarily think about producing these things at a one-to-one scale or a one-to-one trade. I can outsource this, and it's better that I do that more efficiently without worrying about, whether you pray to this god or the other god, whether it be the lioness or the eagle, whatever it be. So that kind of
it works because of Harari often calls these shared fictions. You might call them affordances in certain ways or whatever, but the idea is basically, even if I've never met a person before, even if we've never met or anybody else here haven't met, I can give them $100, and regardless of our religious beliefs or what country we might be from, we know that taking that $100, then we can give something for it, because then we can take that $100 and go give it to other people. And so that, and Harari, I think in the later chapters,
imagine doing that with a remote, undiscovered tribe in the Amazon.
Yeah, it can't happen until they'd have to learn our customs, which would take a generation,
whatever it would be, right? Yeah. So I mean, the thing that's remarkable is that you did have this kind of spontaneous relocation, aggregation of people into towns, became cities. I mean, Jericho is over 10,000. I think it's at least over 5,000 years old. I think it's the longest lived in place in the world. And, there were obviously developed religions at this point, but the thing that's most interesting is that you could have trade among peoples across cultures, across religious lines beyond that, because there was this other base kind of substrate that was able to work beyond those things via tolerance.
Well, there's tolerance, but there's also, and this is why that as nations would assimilate each other, just like it still blows my mind that, we're in this era and we can't, like, all Christians need to acknowledge that, I mean, they can do it a certain way if they want, but they need to acknowledge a lot of what was handed down in their tradition is mixed in paganism, including the Trinity and Mary and the saints, and how that was mixed in paganism, because as the cultures assimilate together, then they had to assimilate their religious beliefs together, because otherwise in the past it was like, oh, we pray to the same gods, or we are we have the same value system, therefore we can trust each other, even if we were for the most part strangers. And this is where some forms of, the original racial issues came in, is because, it's like, oh, we're the same, we look the same, we behave. And then of course there would be for many thousands of years, people would always have to dress a certain way that would, even today, although it's strange to bring it to today, because throughout history, it was, you wanted to dress a certain way to reflect your culture and your position in that culture. And now it's like, because we're in this weird, to whatever degree that wokeness might have to do with it, or just the big unification of humankind, even, and of course, like even Jordan Peterson has a YouTube video that he made, and he's like, I'm against all this equality, so I'm going to wear a suit because it represents a certain thing that I've achieved, and I believe in that. And if you don't believe in that, that's your problem, or whatever. But so now it's like, and like John Vervaeke's an example where he's a like very similar of prestige professor at the same university, actually, but he'll wear t-shirts, and so that's to kind of say, in the way that we look, we're the same. Where
there was a phase transition for Peterson, though. I mean, he used to be the kind of dumpy but still fresh looking professor, and then he sold a few books, and then he started wearing Armani. So good for him.
Well, I mean, he basically had a stylist and a publicist at that point.
He recognized the importance of the public figure.
Well, but what he was saying, because there's a video, maybe I can find it or people can find it. It's one of his older videos, actually, before, it's something like 10 years old. Way before nobody really even knew of maps of meaning, or almost nobody, until 12 Rules of Life, or For Life. But anyway, he said this a long time ago, and I think even in this video, he was wearing his like robe of being an academia of McGill, or wherever he got his PhD, and he's saying like, we can do this. But he was talking about the whole idea of like, some culture wants to be collectivist and make everything equal, but it's part of his whole like rule number 1, stand up straight with your shoulders back, which is another thing, by the way, of like how we have these hierarchies, and our posture will project where we are in that hierarchy. And it comes from our serotonin levels. So if we know that we are at a certain point in the hierarchy, in other words, we know we're going to survive, then we're going to carry ourselves a different way than the person on the street who is barely able to survive. And so that goes into how you physically just carry your body regardless of what's on it. And then it also and that's on the chemical level. And like he makes the point even in that chapter of how the lobsters was the example, because they, in these experiments, they would take a lobster that just lost a fight, and so he's like all droopy, like sad, I'm a depressed lobster, and they would inject him with serotonin. Then he would come back and he would like, I think he'd win a fight, or at least act like he was going to, because he'd be like, oh, and his posture would change and come out and dominate the area. So similar to humans, our serotonin levels is part of it is like, or the way that it goes through our brain, it's like a dominance counter, which the way that it's theorized is like on a scale of 1 to 10 where we are in the dominance hierarchy. My
favorite example is the wrestling rats.
Oh yeah.
And the way that rats will, even though if they are bigger and stronger, they will wrestle with the smaller, punier, younger rats, and they will pin them all the time, except for a few times that will continue to encourage them to keep trying.
Yeah, they have to lose it's like 20 to 30% that they have to lose, otherwise the puny rat will just like get too sad and not participate.
Yeah. And so this is a cultural development somewhere.
Right. So yeah, just like dogs will develop the whole like, I could kill you, but I'm not going to, because I might need you in the future. And that's how that we are each other's bodies
Sadly,
and minds are
cats
also
don't do
affordances.
this.
Yeah, I never trust
I'll
cats.
eat your
That's
face
another
when
thing.
you're dead. But anyway,
Yeah, I never trust cats, but I've had some bad cat experiences in my family. But dogs are great though, because that's another thing he talks about a little bit in one of these chapters, that dogs, on the other hand, co-evolved with humans for tens of thousands of years, where
rather unreasonably,
but it has worked out in a strange way, but where that there would be a mutual benefit in the dogs and humans that would have that relationship. Although,
and and these are not the only animals, right?
Right.
I mean, cows are a very bizarre thing,
right? And it's probably in these next chapters that we might talk about again, and when we do this again in the next couple of weeks, where he talks about if we tamed wheat or if wheat tamed us, because it is sort of like that in a functional way, where wheat was barely a crop on the world and may have even become extinct by now, but now it's like the biggest crop that there is in the world, because and a way you could think of that, sort of theoretically evolutionary whatever, is that because wheat is a certain way that it interacts with our bodies and ourselves in a certain way, we then then we've been able to replenish the earth, so to speak, with wheat. And same thing on with so many other affordances, as we might call them.
Yeah, I mean, there's plenty of there was a lot that you could do once you figured out how to get agriculture going, get all of the necessary irrigation going, harvesting going, the tool making for all of that. You did have entire societies that could change because they suddenly had a difference in caloric value that was coming in, right? You can do so many other things that you couldn't do before. Music, art, all these things. You had something, Goncalo.
Yeah, I was thinking, like, did we win the, I don't know, or whatever, or enslave us, or whatever word you want to use, because it was easy to crop, or because it's higher value in calories? Both, I guess.
Yeah. Oh, did we win in the who tamed who? See, and that's why he says that, because we actually probably lost in some regards, in that and he makes this point even in these introductory sort of chapters, is that our diet used to be a lot better, and then after the agricultural revolution that we'll probably get into next time, now we're just mostly, for a long time, over the past 10 to 12,000 ish years, it's just been a high cereal, high wheat kind of diet, because we figured out how to farm a lot of wheat and turn it into bread and these kind of things.
He's obviously a paleo fan.
Obviously, well, and one of the things too, by the way, with Harari, is he tries to, in his mind, and he's said this in some interviews, is that a good writer will try to just present the history and the ideas free of bias at all. So he tries to not have bias, but he says, what my bias is he's liberal, and he's a practicing Buddhist and some other things. So his biases will come in, and there's nothing he can do about it because he's a human.
Well, and I mean, there's totally an evolutionary history of what we might today call paleo or keto or whatever. There's an even greater history of fasting or intermittent fasting or just downright starving, right? So there's all kinds of things that we are naturally adapted to, that we have very good for everyone, that we've gotten past that. To be able to do the kinds of things that we want. Like, I mean, there was There was something I heard the other day. I don't know what this has to do necessarily with nutrition, but you can think of it maybe as like a facsimile. If you stay awake for 17 hours, if you take an IQ test after you've been awake for 17 hours, it's as though you have drunk 2 glasses of wine. So just imagine a world.
I feel like I'm smarter on 2 glasses of wine.
So. Like so many graduate students I know. Yeah. Anyway, and other substances that are used.
Yeah.
But there's anyway, but the point would be that just imagine if you actually did only have if you just stayed awake while it was daylight.
Yeah.
And imagine early tribal cultures doing something similar to that.
Right.
Maybe going slightly into the night and just moving with the seasons, etc., along with all of that. So, there's so many of these things that we don't really think about as being negatives necessarily, but many of us have never gone there and tried to actually live that way.
Yeah, he makes the point a couple of times that our bodies are basically the same, and even on the cognitive level for the most part, or at least brain structure level, basically the same as they were 70,000-ish years ago. So most of the history that these kind of bodies have been in operation, they have been hunter-gatherers. And so then it's been most of that history and on a paleo sort of diet, you might say. And then the last 10 or 12,000 ish years ago, or years, we've been on this high carb diet. And then he made the point that that's why that we will binge out on things like a tub of ice cream, because as a person with these paleo type bodies, if we would find a tree with a bunch of ripe fruit, figs or whatever, then the smart thing the right thing to do would be to gorge them down. And so with so many things, like when I was talking to Marin, the doctor and neuroscientist a couple weeks ago, he was making the point of how our eyes have other light receptors that or detect blue light, and that's just to kind of tell. And I think we can even tell that when our eyes are closed, because on other animals like lizards, they have the same pineal gland just where it is, but they don't have the same type of eyes. But it's because light can go through the top of their heads and hit the pineal gland, and it'll say it's daytime, so behave this way, and so light will go through. But for us, it's just blue light hitting other parts of our eyeballs that says it's daytime. And so now another aspect of us being maladapted is we're trying to go to sleep looking at our phone screens or whatever, and that throws off our sleep schedule into where that maybe we wake up with a few hours less sleep and behave as if we had 1 glass of wine or whatever. Definitely lowers our cognitive ability with less sleep.
There's a guy that's from the sports science, and he's like kind of a biohacker. And he, in the morning, if there's no sun, usually he puts like a device on his ears to put light, so that his brain wakes up or whatever.
Interesting.
So it's not only through the eyes. There are other orifices that can detect light.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah. So our bodies are basically the same, but they're on, at least on the physical level, they're adapted to living in worlds without the technology that we have, or almost no what we would call, for the most part, technology or tools, because since we started making tools or technologies or affordances on this outside of the body level, our sort of environment has super rapidly changed over the past few thousands of years. So that's a good place to start with all this, because as we get into agriculture and the unification of mankind and the modern revolution, we need that foundation of understanding what we are and where we're at. What do you guys think? We might wrap it up here in a few minutes, but this is a good intro, and we might get more in depth next time.
I had a topic to ask you.
Yeah.
So we in the book it says we were happier when we were hunter-gatherers.
We were what?
Happier.
Oh, happier.
Yeah, happier.
Okay.
Happier.
Yeah.
Okay. We are better nutrition.
Mm-hmm.
So was it a bad idea? I mean, in the book it says that it's inevitable, because once we start, we can't go back for whatever reason.
Yeah, just
I
like
know
that,
about
that
5,000 things which could send us back really quickly. But.
Oh, yeah, especially on the subatomic level. Well, that's a age-old debate or a long debate, is that were we better off then, or are we better off at any point in history before we make ourselves go forward with our technology? And just like the looking at our cell phone screens late at night example, which is relatively new, that's made our lives worse, but in our ego minds, we think that we're better off staring at our phones at 1 o'clock in the morning or whatever the case.
I just don't buy this at all. I'm sorry. Like,
sure.
It's I think this is a almost a quintessential, almost hippie, backward notion. I mean, if you think anything of Harris's arguments, just take the integral of the number of people that once existed and were able to exist for, an average of 30 years or whatever it was back in the day, and take the number of instances that you would consider their mind states to be in pleasure or happy or in full meaningful whatever. Now compare that to a vastly, orders of magnitude greater population who are living 2-3 times as long. Just from that simple construction, I don't buy the argument.
And I think where it starts making a little bit more sense, actually, and this is my third time going through the book, only because I went through it as a local book club a couple years ago. But in the later chapters, I think it makes more sense in that as that we get more technology, per se, that these words are a little whatever, but as we've gotten more technology, or as we've gotten more advanced over the last few decades, especially statistically, especially as we've been able to measure, at least in a survey type way, because that's the only way you can really measure subjective happiness statistically, in the ways that we have to measure whatever happiness is. As we've become more advanced just in the last few decades, the happiness level has gone down, and the ways that we can also observe it, other than just these surveys where you're just literally asking people how happy that they are and such things, is to look at the suicide rate. I don't remember if it's peaked and gone back down yet, but it was going up for a long time. It may have started to peak and gone down a little bit recently. But suicide rates were going up. I
don't expect that with the pandemic, but
yeah, probably not this year. But I think it was peaking and going down a little bit before the past year. But then also similarly, people getting overly addicted to things that they know they shouldn't, like opioids and other drugs that kind of seem to help people deal with sadness.
I think this is a view that is just nostalgic in origin, and it's just bullshit. I don't, if you actually show people history and you finally ask them compared to what, rather than do you feel happy, fulfilled, whatever, I don't think most people would ever think of actually going backward to somehow achieve some form
Well,
of perceived meaning or happiness in this respect.
I think
I think
would
it's
say,
just harder for people to find because purpose is all of a
Mm.
sudden individual
right.
and not socially casted.
Well, so many things are a matter of having to adapt to it. So as we like, just like the internet revolution, we've got all this new like screens always in our hands that are always on, and porn at our fingertips, and all these other things. It will have pros and cons, but it'll take a while for us to adapt it. However many years or decades or generations that might be, there's going to be negative things to having the internet and connectivity, and there's going to be positive things to it. Same thing with, and so a lot of this theory or measures of so-called happiness is because a lot of people who now just have existential time on their hands with nothing to do with it, especially in this era where we don't, like, before, if you had extra time on your hands, you could be like, yay, I'm going to go pray all day or whatever. But now we've lost that connection to, and we're doing so many things that are kind of like connecting to superhuman powers like corporations and countries, but we don't have any deep meaning like this country and this flag, or like, oh, I'm so patriotic, or this corporation means so much to me. It's like we'll always be changing our allegiance to corporations and countries, and sometimes hating the country that we live in, and so many things. But I think that every new level will have its like adaptive sort of like ups and downs as we go through it.
I mean, I think that's a different. I think that's a different argument.
Yeah.
I don't think that's the same thing as basically making the claim that we were supposedly happier and whatnot. I mean, I can't imagine happiness being women dying in childbirth after birthing 5 or 10 or however many children it was. And I can't imagine having the kind of pain from the level of miscarriages or child mortality from infection or sickness in general. I mean, that's just like one quantum of the total suffering that humanity is capable of that isn't due to our own ineptitude. So I don't buy the buy the nostalgia.
Yeah, well, although it's tricky because there are, so like before we had a different
I just think that people think they aren't happy. I mean, I agree that people don't have much meaning today. I totally agree with that. There's a meaning crisis. Go watch John Vervaeke's entire 60 episode, whatever the hell it is now. It's a textbook case for it. But there's a difference between these two things, and most people don't differentiate them. And this is a difficulty because if you actually want to talk about something that gives people the most level of pleasure and also feeling right with themselves, the world, their community, etc., that's meaning, that's not happiness. And that requires a purpose, which we don't have anymore. Before we had castes, we had very specific gender roles, we had all these different things, and those have all in some way gone by the wayside because of modernity. You don't have cobblers or farmers very much anymore. They're around, but not very many of them. So it's hard to figure out ways of applying ourselves because we do have such an infinite spectrum of possibilities. But if you actually get down to brass tacks of just comparing levels of suffering, of capability with treatment, of lifetime length, etc. I mean, the history of human flourishing since the Enlightenment has been incredible, and since even just medieval period has been incredible.
So I guess again, it's like it's one thing to compare like us to our hunter-gatherer ancestors however many tens of thousands of years ago. But then maybe the other more meaningful sort of debate is just the last few decades, as we've kind of like super overwhelmed us with technology, because what you see in basically as the world becomes more third world countries become these emerging markets and everything, that eliminates poverty and all the things associated with poverty and everything else. So as technology or these new affordances or new tools come into these areas, especially the third world, and like right now what's his name, Elon Musk is trying to get his it's not called Skynet, Skytrain or whatever, to give internet to the whole world and all that, because as the world gets these new technologies or affordances, it makes that level of their life better, but it's an adaptive process to where it is and because I think what it is too is that, and I'm maybe just trying to see both sides, and it's more of the modern issue than the sort of like prehistoric to now issue, but it's the it is this finding meaning now, especially because now it's just like every person who's born, it's almost like you're a slave to the existence. Before you'd have to work so hard just to survive, and now it's like you can't kill yourself. Like it's hard to kill yourself. Not that anybody should do that or anything, but it's like it's harder to kill yourself or count on dying than.
And if you do die, we'll just freeze your brain and put you in a new body in 10,000 years when we have the technology, right?
Yeah, or maybe even if we don't do that, we'll have enough of your DNA that we can, even if we didn't freeze your brain, we can clone you. I'm gonna be back. They're like, sorry, I thought you could kill yourself, but deal with it. Now we've at least cloned your brain, so you're a consciousness in a jar, which we hooked up to a matrix-like simulation, and that's the reality now. So deal with it.
like the end of artificial intelligence with the silicon aliens and whatnot.
Yeah. You go ahead.
Can I? So in the past, we weren't really able to choose a meaning, right? We had to survive, to raise cattle, whatever, because we would survive. Now we can choose that meaning, right? We can do whatever we want. If I want my meaning to be dancing, I can make money and survive dancing or whatever. So there's more possibilities. However, that possibility creates space for, I don't know, being lost, something like that.
Yeah. Failure.
Well, what it does, and this is why there's a lot of the issues that we have today, is so everything used to be all like a collectivist mindset. Even if you acted like it wasn't, it was, and it still is to a large degree now. But so now it's because it used to be just like, oh, you're born in this tribe, so everything's about the collectivism of this tribe and this belief system and whatever else. And now you're born in the world, and it's like you're gonna be here probably for 70-ish years, so deal with it. And since you got to deal with it, why are you dealing with it? And that has to happen on the individual level, because then each individual either has to just like find their own meaning from the ground up within themselves, and or just plug into these collectivisms that's going on. And that's a lot of responsibility that no individuals really had to do before they just plugged into whatever people around them were doing.
So there's an even more recent example of this, right? I mean, what is Isaac's last name? It's Miller. What did that mean in 1400s, 1500s France?
Now it means nothing. It's just like my dad had that name, so I have to. It's just handed to me. But before you would have.
But
Miller
for hundreds
of
years of serfdom, you were by trade and by name someone who milled grain.
Yeah, and you couldn't choose like, well, I'm just gonna go be a professional dancer.
No, I mean, you're not gonna be Twyla overnight, but there's a whole history to that, right? Where you did what your father or you did what your grandfather did or something like that. And if
Right.
you were a woman, well,
You make babies.
yeah, you did what your
What-
mother did.
Well,
Anyway,
and you
there
know,
there were definitely roles that they had.
yeah.
And there were communities that they maintained and all these other things, and they definitely had a connection between each other.
Well, they would
And
have their
all
own
those.
matriarchal culture
Sure.
aside of the patriarchal culture.
Yes.
But the other reason this is, and it goes back to our hunter-gatherer times, to those forebears or whatever word is because, well, from then all the way up to what is the scientific revolution, was that even in the last 100-ish years, was that if we don't put the man energy into protecting the female, that is the seed of life. And so if the female isn't, like, as you know, like they say, barefoot and pregnant.
There's a more concrete example.
Sure.
So I cannot remember the author, but I believe she trained as a anthropologist and then has gotten into kind of social anthropology. Ken Wilber has talked about this several times.
No.
But the example basically is that if you look at the transition from, as Palia would say, from earth cult to sky cult, which was around the same time as agriculture became a thing, and we started to study the changing of the seasons and the coming of the rains and the whatever it be.
Right.
When we were beholden to those kinds of powers, we began to basically lose the deification of the female because we began to understand the moons. Okay, we no longer thought of the female as this liquid, kind of chaotic thing that we don't know when she's going to be able to ovulate, etc. Not that we would ever use that term. But then secondarily on top of this, right, when we move back into or further into agriculture, if you do the biological studies and you study the anthropology, the conclusion supposedly is that, from this female author, I cannot recall her name, is that basically one thing you found was that in agrarian societies, if women were working in the fields, they had a higher miscarriage rate. Just because of, if you're stressing if you don't have plow animals and you're plowing fields or whatever yourself, the way that muscles are contracting, etc., can have bad effects. That doesn't mean that doesn't legitimize all of the other shit that happened after that.
What that means is for all of our history up until the last couple 100-ish years, it was about keeping the female body safe, and if we didn't, we would not have humans. If women were out there, fighting the lions and the other tribes, and if they were out there plowing the fields, instead we keep them safe to make babies, and they impart their wisdom to man, and then men do their risky behaviors, their risk-prone behaviors, because if a man dies, that's unfortunate, but
there's a lot more of them.
And his widow can still make babies, where if you take a couple that's a man and woman,
one of the sexes is expendable, physically expendable. So this would be what I would say. One of the sexes has been historically physically expendable.
Right.
One of them has been emotionally and or spiritually expendable. And the optimization of this is arguably, tragic and disgusting and whatnot, but it was what it was for a variety of reasons that we are only now coming to terms with and may never actually fully understand.
A lot of this gets
the extension of that into more modern forms of oppression is at least regrettable, if not egregious.
Well, you're right, because what that is for all known history-ish, like as far back as we know, it was this keep women in the home protected, because that's where new humans come from. And so but then over these last few hundred years.
And that was a form of worship at some point, right?
Right.
I mean, male gods were very rare before
Mm-hmm.
about 10, 20,000 years ago.
Right. And so so we had this baked into us that women need to stay home, and really out of compassion, because we want them to be safe, and we want them to, as much as maybe it might hurt them, they love, and it's in the female nature to make babies.
But this comes back to your original question about movements and all these other things. We lost at some point that original idea, right?
So it's baked into us to keep women in their place, so to speak, but we've lost why that was.
Yeah, and then that descends into forms of oppression,
right, which
and
is
hatred,
wrong.
and thinking less of, and all of these other things. I mean, it's true that there is a difference between men and women in upper body strength, but there is very little difference in long distance running capability.
Right,
and that makes perfect evolutionary sense.
Well, and cognitively,
I mean, there are some differences, but they are marginal at best.
Right. Well, in the modern world, women are probably more suited because of their right brain, left brain connections cognitively. So that's why, if you look at the way our structures go in society, women will outperform men in a lot of ways, especially academically, because of the way that their brains and behavior are. Then the only reason that makes a big difference over time is because, one, women will often make the choice to be with their family and their maternity situations, and then also just because men and their risky behavior, sort of testosterone, will be sort of stupid in thinking that it's cool to work like sometimes 100 hours a week. Men are more prone to make that poor decision.
I mean, I think one way of saying one way of encapsulating what you're saying is there is an evolutionary need for maternalism and for an agent that will give us some kind of collective binding. And generally, the person to do that is not a man. Just from, I mean, think of emotional skills, emotional intelligence, if you will. Think of verbal skills, verbal intelligence, which, believe it or not, most men are not very high in compared to women.
Right.
And think of then just the capability to be affectionate, to be able to actually impart some grace to your children and your collective as a whole. I mean, you brought up something, Goncalo, earlier that was talked about, which was like the we have more neurons. I think both of you brought up that we have more neurons in our hands than any other, our paws, than any other animal. And I do kind of wonder, it's not inferred, I think, in the book, but I do wonder how much of that was due to just the social evolution of us, right? Because if we're just cats or dogs or something and we push each other around, we can do just fine, but we can't caress each other. We can't deepen emotional bonds through physicality in the same way.
And Harari made the point of how one activity that strengthens social bonds that you see in apes or chimps, for example, they'll groom each other with their hands. They're not bipedal the same way that we are, but they have the use of their front hands more, so they will groom each other. And that's why, even up until almost now, and still now in some cultures, it's a big deal for like women to go to the beauty shop and hang out, or men maybe to go to the barber shop and hang out, because what they're doing is they're engaging in that
ritualistic grooming.
Yeah, exactly. And same thing, even to a different way, with the way that girls a bit more than men will hang out at the when they're getting their toes done and their hands done and all that. It's the same type of thing. If it wasn't for that millions of years, or at least tens of thousands of years of history of the ritualistic grooming. And we even had that in our religious practice up until even some still do ritual foot washing, which is a similar thing. And what that does is it builds trust, because the more that you can touch a person and they don't stab you or take advantage of you, the more that builds that trust. Just like kissing babies, politicians will do. So there's that image of them being trusted with that in their hands and everything. And I forget how Harari worded it, I think in chapter 2, but it's so in the chimp cultures or ape cultures, it's the alpha male that would be the leader of their troop. But what would make that particular one the leader of this pack, or whatever the word is, for leading dozens and sometimes up to about 100.
I think they're called troops.
Yeah, there are troops in this regard. You're right. So what would is it? He made the point that it's not necessarily who's the strongest, but it's who can form the greatest coalitions. And that has then translated into the way that, especially, and he makes this point again later in the scientific revolution chapters, where he talks about how now it's been like the revolution of the nerds, because it's no longer the greatest military generals that are looked up as like the highest on the social hierarchies or the strongest men. It's Bill Gates and Warren Buffett, Steve Jobs, and now Elon Musk, who are these nerds with their mega brains that are the leaders of the world.
But they have an important distinction, right? Which is that they were able to, through their own hard work and through their own communication skills, or some would argue lack thereof, but enough, they were able to convince a lot of other people to join in their escapades, to fund their work, all these other things. So there is a form of kind of social intelligence or emotional intelligence which is required to do that. If anyone has ever read Outliers from Gladwell, he talks about like the guy who has the highest IQ in the world or something.
Yeah, Chris Langdon.
He's a bar bouncer out in Montana.
Yeah, I read this story because he doesn't have the he had one of the highest IQs in the world for a long time, but he has no social skills because he grew up poor.
Well, yeah, I mean, it wasn't just that he grew up poor, but there's a lot of other.
Yeah, there's
he has no respect for any forms of authority,
right? And when he was going to university, he like blamed all of his professors, like those stupid professors. Where he used the example of some other people, I think in that book, that had probably lower IQs, but better social intelligence. I think he used the example of another elementary physicist. What was his name from the Manhattan Project?
Oppenheimer.
Yeah, he used the example of Oppenheimer, where
I don't remember that one, but remind me.
Well, Oppenheimer, basically smart guy, a lot of social issues, but he basically was able to ascend to the top of those sort of hierarchies at that time because of his social prowess, where he may not have had a 200 IQ, maybe it was in the 150 range or whatever, but because he was higher on the better performing in what we might call social intelligence, then he was able to ascend and accomplish what he did.
The art of good business is being a good middleman. Yeah. And that's a very bad way of maybe paraphrasing it, but there is something to be said for managerial capability.
Yeah.
What are you saying, Goncalo?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so can we really make the connection between social intelligence and productivity or whatever you're saying?
I would say they are negatively correlated.
Well, okay. So, a couple of things. One, I actually remember that book. I was helping someone with their homework on it actually, but on outliers, and he gave some good examples, and he was making a correlation of how like in the NBA, if you're 5 feet tall, you're not going to make it, and some people that are in the 5 foot range, they make it, but they do better and better when they get up into the 6'6" range. But then you would almost think that the guy who's 7'6" is going to be the best, but it doesn't work that way. There's like a certain
there's a maximum.
Yeah, and the thing with IQ, it's not necessarily that as your IQ goes up, you're at a disadvantage. Although sometimes people will say that gives you like maybe some existential dread or certain things like that. But it has a certain diminishing return after somewhere between like 120 and 170 ish, where it almost doesn't matter after a certain point what your IQ is. Because it's good enough to do what we need to do in the world that we operate in, and then to the social intelligence thing,
and even then, that's only a quarter or less of the predictive variance of successful people. So
yeah, well, and so to the social intelligence thing, so like what Harari was saying here is that it's not the smartest or the strongest that necessarily does the best, but it's who has the best coalition. Same thing with politics and in these corporate situations. Like another example that comes to mind in this, I think it was Paul Graham. Another author that I like is Robert Greene, and one of his biggest books or best books is Mastery, and which is sort of similar to Outliers. But he's giving examples of people that were masters at that they were doing. But he gave the example of Paul Graham, who did a lot of things with developing the internet, and then made this it's Y Combinator, I think is what he started, which is this business that helps launch more businesses. But anyway, he couldn't do it on his own. He had no social skills at all. But at a certain point, 20 something years ago, he partnered with his wife that then would handle all of the people side of the businesses that he was in. And because he then had his wife to deal with the people, because he was basically clueless when it came to social interaction, he was just great at certain computer things and business things, but clueless with people. But because he partnered with his wife, who was great with people, then he had super success and he became a billionaire. So you do need to have both. Like Chris Langdon, for example, who had about a 200 IQ, one of the smartest people in the world.
Which, by the way, is not directly measured. It's extrapolated. But
yeah, just like a statistical variation on how well we can solve certain puzzles, which is so it's hard to measure very precisely. But he had at least about 190-ish IQ, maybe over 200, and which is more common now. But one of the first people to have an IQ that high, but he could never attain a certain level of success in the way that we look at success because he lacked the social prowess. He might be one of the smartest people ever, or at least by some measures. And actually right now you can find what he wrote recently as he's been more retired on his farm, called the CTMU, Cognitive Theoretical Model of the Universe, where he thinks that he made a
theory of everything.
Theory of everything, and it also proves God basically in consciousness, and it's similar to a Jungian or a Ken Wilber view, but he tries to do it more on the physics level. So I don't know if that got to your... Go ahead.
To your question though, Goncalo, this is anecdotal from my own experience, but in some respect, I do think that highly emotionally intelligent people who also, for instance, can do something, that they get in somewhere and they are able to convince people that they're useful, but they, have administration or managerial sides of things on their mind. uh, it's interesting because you can have individuals which are not as individually successful, or individually productive would be a better way of saying it, but the collective would improve from their managerial capabilities. So you can have people who make it their job, right, to make other people more productive
Right.
by helping them in some way, orienting them here or there. There's an interesting, I mean, this is kind of a side point, but there's a story about Richard Feynman where he was at lunch at MIT, I think. It was MIT or Stanford, I can't remember. And he was at lunch with this fluid dynamicist who had been working on this problem for 2 years. And he sat down and he listened to them and whatever. And then after 15 minutes of listening, he kind of like jotted something on a napkin, and they went back to the office and they solved it. There are those kinds of people who, from whatever perspective they're coming from, they can be useful to other people from like an outsider's perspective. And if you can collect a bunch of those people to help you manage your collective, be your kind of the people who construct your overarching vision for not just themselves, but the larger scheme of things, for your working groups, for your businesses, for your society as a whole, then you can achieve more things collectively. Oh, you're muted, Isaac.
May I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, I was going to say, like, when you were talking about the higher IQ people that are usually less good socially, I think you were saying.
Well, not necessarily that they're usually less good socially, but that sometimes that they are. But there's some that are good socially, and so then they do better, and then sometimes that they are partnered with people who are better at that. But go ahead.
There are so few of them; it's hard to draw anything definitive.
Yeah.
And I think there's a correlation between higher IQ and higher in the spectrum of autism, or no? Maybe not.
I've heard this, but I've never read a study on it.
Yeah.
That's it's tough to say, because like I know that is sometimes the case. Like definitely some people with very high IQs that are also somewhat autistic, but then it just gets weird, because it's then of course, because IQ, it's basically your ability to quickly put together patterns, and so sometimes you can have a very autistic person. Like I think the movie Rain Man was an example of a real life situation, or based on a true story. Also, what's the guy's name who had Asperger's? Forget his name, but basically he predicted, I mean, other people did, but he most predicted the 2008 financial crisis, and was, so he's like a financial guy. So anyway, there is maybe some correlation, but it's hard to say what the correlation is. But by the way, that also gets into the issue of like, what success is and things on that line, which is, I was going to mention Wall Street guys anyway, because Wall Street guys might be the slimiest, scummiest people in the world, but by some measures they are the most successful, and some of that is social, and some of that is their ability to do one thing with financial, stock markets, and whatever else.
They also have the highest capability of scaling all of their talents.
Yeah. So this is why it's just interesting the way that we measure success nowadays, or something like that. And yeah,
I mean, I think it may be an interesting, if we rotate this back to the prehistory thing.
Yeah.
Because there are always going to be these super smart people on the spectrum. There's going to be There's going to be
people.
homosexuals. There's going to be bisexuals. There's going to
pansexuals.
be vegetarian. What was that?
Transsexuals.
Yes, there were third gender in Native American Native American tribes was a thing.
Well,
usually,
if you're going back in history, there's castration at every age, especially for shaman for young people, and then of course eunuchs go way back, and then
worshiping goddesses. If you were to become a priest or a servant to a goddess, you would usually ritually castrate yourself.
And a lot of people were in a lot of cultures, because men basically didn't have use of their balls after they were 40 or 50 years old. If they survived that long, they would get castrated when they were about 40 or 50 years old.
Well, if you're the Catholic Church, you do it properly at the age of 8 to maintain that beautiful voice.
Anyway. That's another Dark Ages thing. But anyway,
that lasted through the 1800s, by the way. I think the last castrati was like in 1830 or something.
That's gross, but
just to put that in perspective, like that was that was almost at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. Like this was after John Locke. This was after Thomas.
Yeah, after America started. Yeah. Gross. Anyway, were you going somewhere before I got on the derailed with the balls, or the lack thereof of balls?
No, but I think it's interesting to consider that even when you consider lineages of relatively small size, who had generally a very uniform culture, who had uniform belief systems, value systems, etc., religious backgrounds, origins, that really didn't, if they were an agricultural society, they didn't do much traveling. If you go back to hunter-gatherers, they would move with the wildebeest or the buffalo or whatever it was that they were doing, but they were migratory. That's the word.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing is that in many of these traditional cultures, even the ones that we know of today, there were accommodations for all of these kinds of, shall we call them eccentric identities that would not necessarily in today's thought be as easily assimilated into the larger whole, which is interesting because we have record of it working within certain smaller places, but not larger places. At least in traditional kind of, maybe not necessarily Western societies, but I also, just as far as like the intelligence thing, I don't know if I mentioned this last time, but there's a beautiful chapter in a book called Wealth, Poverty, and Politics by Thomas Sowell, who he talks about rural mountain towns in Italy and also in Tennessee in the 1930s and 40s mainly. And what they did was they did long-term IQ evaluations of children. So like they came in, I think they started at like 8, something like that.
Yeah.
And they would test them every year, I think until they were 21. It might have been 18. But what you saw was in rural places versus the nominal average was that you actually saw IQ decrease. Now, from what we understand about IQ, that isn't necessarily possible, as long as like you maintain relative nutrition and all these things and you correct for all these other things. But you would actually drop off on an average of about 10 points, which is almost a standard deviation.
Yeah.
So the thing that this was interesting was that they basically chalked it up to the fact that it's a cultural problem.
Yeah.
Because if you have a smart kid, and let's say that he doesn't realize yet that he's smart,
or he doesn't value his intelligence.
Well, or no, not that he doesn't value it yet, but that he gets taught not to value it.
Sure.
Because what happens when you're the smart little asshole, like we all probably used to be on this call, when we are, correcting people, and for instance,
then we get our asses.
It's a troop. It's a troop of
the troop kicks our ass.
By the way, it's also Denisovan, not Denisovan. But
again, that might be because I listen on Audible and the guy who's reading it is British.
I totally understand. But I mean, imagine that in a small town, in a rural town that doesn't necessarily, I mean, if you look at mountain towns in general, they're historically very backward. They're very separated, isolated. They don't have trade. They don't have ideas being traded back and forth, let alone goods.
Right.
So if you have this very isolated place, you're going to stick out like a sore thumb. And so what's the easier thing to do? The easier thing to do is to at least mediate, if not downgrade, your own intelligence via practice, because you don't want to be seen as, you know, the little annoying kid, basically. And this has been replicated in lots of rural places. So it's interesting that there may be mimetic cultural aspects that might go back very far in prehistory that could actually have in some way prevented you know, the super smart from arising.
And it reminds me, actually, I'm visiting a friend right now in Florida who I went to high school with, and I remember one of the teachers in one of the classes that we're in, because he's like a smart guy, but he kind of downplays it, and he's just like a DJ now or whatever, and that's cool. But in high school, his one of the teachers would say to him, like, you're just trying to not do well so you won't have the responsibility of doing well. And a lot of people do that into what you're talking about, to not just not value doing well, right? Not just not value doing well, but act below their ability. And, you know, and to get into kind of like the psychological aspect of all this on the same line, and into a lot of what we normally or often talk about, is it's stressful and it's cognitively I don't know what the word is, taxing to say, okay, now I have performed at this level and I have to continue to do so, or I will be denigrated for it, and sometimes get your ass kicked if you do so in certain ways. So we often will, and sometimes we don't realize that we're doing this. Like, I remember my friend when the teacher said that to him, he's like, I never thought of it that way, but yeah, maybe. You know, so sometimes it's unconscious, just like, so we might unconsciously adapt the behavior to act dumber or act below our cognitive ability, because not just we don't want to get our ass kicked.
Have you ever been in Starbucks on a Saturday afternoon?
And you want to kick some, you want to kick some ass.
I mean, it's just, I think that Robin Williams called them little texting covens, where, you know, you have the 8 little teenage girls all dressed up, not talking, texting, and then one of them looks up and says, I know, and then goes back to texting. And so, you know, there's a whole range of downgrading that people can do because it facilitates greater social mobility, all these things.
Yeah, and that might get partly into certain values. Like sometimes I say it's all about having a value structure and a value hierarchy, because sometimes we overly, especially when maybe we're in our 20s, we overly value money and beauty. But then as we become more mature, we have to be careful not to say money is bad and beauty is bad. But we want to say those are just lower on the hierarchy. And so a lot of times, like, you'll see like groups of girls like that, and like the most important thing is being like pretty and popular, and so they're all about that, because then that moves them up that social hierarchy, and that kind of gets into the tricky thing of this handed down idea of what makes a woman valuable, and in a lot of ways it's her sexual attractiveness, which that there's nothing we can do about that right away. That is our handed down behavior, and it will be for a while. Not that that's necessarily
it's
the
not
right
necessarily thing. It contrary to popular belief, I don't necessarily buy that it is only men that are doing that. I think I think that's a definite component. I think it's a definite component, but I
Because if you ask any girl who is honestly aware and all that, and you're like, why do you spend all this time putting on your makeup and worrying about like a centimeter of fat in certain areas or whatever? It's not because they're trying to get laid, so to speak, as the guys might be trying to do when they're like spending forever on their hair and whatever else. But the girl will tell you it's because I want to be the prettiest girl in my girl group, so it's to impress, and that's why
we're generalizing here.
We're generalizing, and as much as that is, it's also unconscious a lot of times. And I guess to kind of tie it back into all this and weave it all together, as we're a little over 2 hours now, is that another reason. So all this has to do with humans being more intelligent than for our own good, in so many ways, including we've really put our species physically at risk, especially the women, because we've gotten such a large brain compared to the pelvis that we physically need to go through most of the time, in that the waist or the pelvis bone of a female has gotten as far apart as it could, but being able to still run, but at the same time, and so that's as far apart of it as it can get, to be able to also get this human head through. That's actually, for that size of head, it's a few months to maybe even a couple of years premature. So if we were, so to speak, evolved differently, it might be more appropriate if we got born sooner and put into pouches like marsupials, but that didn't happen to us. So instead we're this thing that's a huge liability as a baby, that it clings to its mother and wants that breast milk, and that is just innate into our DNA right away. But then
it is a bizarre optimization that you would risk the other half of your mated pair every time that you decide to procreate, and then not even have a guarantee that your child survive. And then you have to wait for that child to mature at least like 6 to 10 years for them to be functional.
Right.
So yeah, it's
not just that they're unfunctional, but they're a huge liability, especially, and they're screaming. You have to take care of them, and they scream, which makes you susceptible to prey and other things that are looking for things like this. And then in the sort of like patriarchal sort of issue is that the babies are going to cling to the moms, and so the moms then, for the most part, and this goes into male female dynamics even today, is how for the most part the female coding, so to speak, is that they want to be protected and provided for, and that's because whether they're going to have babies or not, they feel that way because it's a vulnerable world. And although it's kind of becoming, and this is why that now in our modern world, it's like the man is looked at as like the dumb guy that you see on The Simpsons or any other sitcom,
which, to be clear, is not far off.
Well, it's not, and it's very realistic in that the man, he might be a protector and provider, but he's for the most part dumb, because for the most part all he has to do is make sure that a woman can have her rent paid and everything, and then the woman then provides the cognitive structure for that family unit, and then hopefully they'll flourish, and hopefully they will be more they'll do better than The Simpsons or some of these families that denigrate the male, and now that's getting into our so much of our culture and the stories of, we shouldn't probably denigrate either gender, but we should try to find, the word isn't equality, but it's a
balance.
Yeah, it's a co-balance, because there's some areas where like a guy will probably never be able to make a baby, and a girl, maybe she will never have the upper body strength and some other things.
It's 2021, baby.
Oh yeah. But anyway, that's where we're at. We've become overly intelligent to the point that it puts our species at risk, and so we've had to adapt in a lot of strange ways. what else do you guys got?
No, I think that this is interesting because
Mhm.
I would have to really ask experts, of course, but there's some kind of happy low value for intelligence, actually. Like, we have to be functional enough to work collectively, which is of course the strength of our species and why we've gotten where we've gotten. But beyond that, in small groups, as I kind of discussed, there's a problem, at least from a behavioral perspective. But then also, of course, there's the biological morphological birth canal problem.
Right.
And so, you can't have a brain has too many neurons, or you're going to be, over the limit, and you're going to destroy a whole half of your population almost all the time, right?
Yeah,
so
we really push that to the limit, and that not just females dying because the baby was screaming and they got eaten by a lion or whatever, but it was a regular occurrence that females would die during childbirth.
We're talking about hemorrhaging, we're talking about all these terrible things that can happen. So
all the way up until the scientific revolution in the past couple hundred or few hundred years.
And which somehow the United States is still not entirely up to par with other people about. But
which part?
We have very high female mortality rates during childbirth. Really? Now there's so I think the number is something like 10 or 15 per 100,000 for most European countries. And I think it's like 700 or something for the United States. I'm pretty confident on that 700 number. I'm not confident on the first number, but there is a question, right, of, what are the differences in diet and overall health and obesity, and how does that correlate with high blood pressure, and how does that correlate with all of these other
and the values of certain what America is and what makes us have the advantages and disadvantages is that we're very diverse, and that some people in America will be very like great diet and great all those things, and great at like doing the best things in regards to hospitals and those kind of things. Other people, not so much. It's like, I got a baby in me. Well, one tarnation. I'm not going to no hospital. That's just a big scam.
Are you trying to do an impersonation of me? I don't understand.
Oh yeah, because you're in Tennessee, and that's
hello.
But yeah, some people are very skeptical.
Come back now. You hear?
Yeah, some people are very skeptical to medicine and hospitals and such. So yeah,
that is obviously a Californian accent that you need to be doing then, right? Not a Tennessee accent.
I don't know. I just know that there's some hillbillies, whether they're Beverly Hillbillies or whatever kind, that don't partake in the hospitals and such things so much.
Oh, I know. I'm joking about the measles outbreak in California, but anyway. But no, there's a whole interesting history here that is definitely one of very long-term optimization, and I think we're still trying to figure out what those optimizations were and why they were made.
Yeah, so that is the issue of trying to figure out what we mean, or what humanity means, in that we kind of just do what we're doing, almost like in the middle of this pandemic thing that we're still dealing with. Like in 50 years, everybody will be like, those stupid freaking idiots back in 2020, 2021, dealing with their pandemic this way. Don't they know they could have just done boom, 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 and then had like dealt with their pandemic and their culture and their economics this way? Because it's hard to deal with things while that we're in it, especially in like our maladapted bodies and brains to certain situations that we're now aware of. So but we look at ourselves and we look at history, we're like, what does it mean? What are we going towards? We're marching towards something, even if that's annihilation, or hopefully it's not, maybe in 100 or a few hundred years will become a level 1 civilization, and that's a whole other thing. So hopefully it's marching toward something of a positive thing more than a negative thing, and we try to put purpose to the direction of the progress or direction of society, but that's not always easy.
Nice.
You guys have anything else to add before we wrap up this discussion? Go ahead, Goncalo.
Yeah. So you kind of made said that men are dumber, or for
behave dumber. And,
if anyone takes anything away from this, just know what we
men are stupid, idiot, assholes. I hate men. Go ahead.
Yeah. So
now you're really doing an impression of me, and it hurts.
Oh, sorry. Wow, that was unconscious. So it sounds like you have a unconscious.
I'm totally
insecurity.
joking.
I know. Anyway, so what about stupid men, Goncalo?
So, like, yeah, man, I would say that there are bad sides to being smart, like you said, and so, man,
pros and cons to being smart, and pros and cons to being either gender. But yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. And so, men can be seen as dumb, like, but men are also usually the experts in most of the fields, right? Like in
the way that it's measured, and then, well, that's a tricky one, because that looks at the extremes of everything.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like sometimes Jordan Peterson gives this example of how if you look at so like an example, he had a couple examples of looking at like men and women incarceration rates, for example, but that's that's saying that men in general, it looks like men are super more violent because they go to prison a lot more, especially for violent things. And that's kind of
higher
true.
Rates of ADHD, all those things.
Yeah, and that's kind of true because of higher testosterone levels and higher physical upper body strength, and a lot of those things that could lead to those type of things. But also it's just looking at the extremes. But then if you look at the median levels, or those in the middle, not the extreme, sometimes you'll find that women are violent. I don't know if we'd say as much as men, but it depends on how you determine the violence. Is it like a slap in the face, or is it
verbal abuse
to the point where the guy wishes he was never born, and he like sleeps in the garage?
He obviously deserved it, by the way.
He obviously deserved it, because men are horrible, stupid creatures. There's some sarcasm today, but
we should read Men Are Pigs by what's her name. I can't remember what.
Well, we are.
She wrote an interesting manifesto. Anyway.
But to the point of what you're sort of asking is, it's hard to say, and this kind of gets into the whole like gender equality pay gap issue, because the reason that men are often statistically paid better is partly because women take time off work for maternity and family reasons, and then also because women are more interested in people where men are more interested in things. And then it's also because men are stupid enough in some value definitions to work sometimes 100 or more hours a week, where it's like women are like working 40, 50, 60 hours a week is enough, so they only do that. So it's hard to measure the extremes.
It does depend on some things, like what Isaac just talked about. There's also one of the major things there is the scalability of particular products coming from particular professions, right? If you work in if I just adopt a terrible stereotype, but it is kind of true as far as a population is concerned, it's very hard to scale healthcare. There are very few male nurses, many female nurses. And it's hard to scale that proportionally like you would with an industrial creation of some kind. There is another interesting example that Pinker talks about, which is mathematically precocious youths. And if you look at mathematically precocious youths, I think they get adopted into this category when they're like 5 or 7, or it's something around there. But basically, if you look at people who are mathematically precocious, mathematically capable, interested, curious, etc., you basically have an equal population of pretty much equally talented men and women, boys and girls. But if you track them through college, many of them go and they do mathematics degrees, and they excel. And again, of those particular ones that come in, about half and half go to college, about half and half still end up being just as successful. But the difference is that at the end, when they start deciding whether they're going to go to graduate school, or at least maybe a PhD to differentiate things, because I think there are quite a few women who go into master's programs. But the interesting thing is that basically women don't very often go into professional math, as in academia, basically, because they actually outcompete men in other regimes. So if you look at the difference,
and they're less autistic.
I don't know about that one, but one of the things to kind of get into your point a little bit of what you're intimating possibly is that it's been shown that of mathematically precocious youths tracked from this period of time who go to school for math, etc., what you find is that really the only difference between these two groups in any kind of a significant level is their verbal intelligence, so their ability to communicate. And it just so happens that women are in that category of mathematically precocious youths much more capable in explaining themselves and communicating than the men are. So now just think about that for a second. What could a mathematically precocious, smart female do who can talk socks off and explain themselves really well? Where could they be useful? Well, if you're a smart industrialist, if you're a smart business person, you want them like that, right? Because what would kill more in a boardroom than someone who can run you the numbers, be female in a male dominated thing, which can be actually useful to you as a hiring practice, both for political, but also for, actual useful capitalistic reasons, and someone who's able to communicate well. Right. And if you have a man who's just as capable, but they're not able to do the communication part, well, where do they stay? They stay where they're most safe and least useful. Okay. Arguably
serial killers.
Which is
I don't know if I'm going to go with academicians as being serial killers.
No, but I know where you're going. But although that does get into, as we talk about, and we get into these things that Harari did touch a little bit on, but that other difference isn't just like, and that's the tricky thing about some of these studies you do on, how men and women behave in crime settings.
And there's one other evidence thing here, which is that Soul has done studies before that he's written about, ones that he's done himself and ones that he's quoted. And actually, if you look up Glassdoor statistics on this, Glassdoor has a report on gender pay gap almost every year, and it's it's a tome, but it's an interesting read usually. And one of the things that Soul had shown, though, is that back all the way in the 70s, if you controlled for women who were continuously working since high school, who were never married, who had equivalent education degrees to their male counterparts, and who had the same job, in many of those cases, women were making more than men.
Yeah, that makes
But
sense.
one of the key things there is the cultural factor, which is that women who were never married and who were continuously working since high school. Now, how many even today do you know of girls who do that?
Yeah.
Like,
Well,
but back in the 1970s, at least 1960s, that was something that
although I
even then was
imagine
not appropriate at the time.
what that will immediately fall into is the second indicator of success statistically that we can measure after IQ or intelligence is industriousness in a personality type, and
Conscientiousness. Yeah.
conscientiousness, which part of that is industriousness, and that is often higher in women, especially women who kind of meet that profile, that they are working, they have a career and not a family. They would usually be the type that would be higher in conscientiousness, which is often a personality indicator of
it's hard to be
success.
maternal without such a trait, right? Not that all women
Right.
are maternal, but if you are to have maternal qualities, you have to be conscientious.
Right. And guys often struggle in that area. That's why they might be good at certain things, but bad in conscientiousness. So they just want to like whatever work on their craft, but they're very unconscientious, and so they will fail in a lot of degrees. But women, on the other hand, will kind of be taking care of them, being higher in conscientiousness. And by the way, on the Thomas Sowell thing, I just figured this out recently. Another advantage, and I don't get paid by Audible or anything, but Thomas Sowell, unfortunately, he passed away recently, but he had
Wait a minute, what?
Hmm?
Thomas Sowell passed away?
Didn't he? Like
he ended his column a few years ago.
No, wait.
I'm looking it up real quick.
Okay.
I don't. If that happened, I didn't know.
I think it was recently, but I might have got wires crossed. So look that up.
I think you might be thinking of is it Williams? There was another black economist who Walter Williams died. Yeah, he hasn't died. Yeah. Thomas Sowell is still alive.
Okay.
I think you're thinking of Walter Williams.
That may be, and so
yeah, Walter Williams died in December 2nd, 2020, and was another famous black American economist and sociologist.
Sure. That might have, so thanks for stopping me there before I started a bad or perhaps a wrong rumor and all that such things. Anyway, back to reality. Thomas Sowell's alive, thank God. And a lot of his books you can get for free with your Audible subscription. Not just the one-time promotional free, but he has like half of the books that he published, which is several, that are included for free and with the Audible subscription. Even if you only subscribe for one month, you can download them, and then you've got most of his books for free that you can always listen as long as you have the app. And those are important works, but and then
sadly he doesn't read any of them.
Oh well,
but anyway,
in a way,
there's other capable,
but yeah. But anyway, cool. It's been about 2.5 hours, guys, and this has been a good discussion on the notes of this chapter and the foundation of what makes humans special. What do you think, Goncalo? You always seem to have like an extra thing in your notes before we wrap it up. Or do we go through all your notes already?
What makes humans special?
Well, that's what we've been talking about.
I mean, in the book, he said we create fictions, right?
Mm-hmm.
I guess that's it.
What isn't special about, all of the terrible things we've done through history?
Yeah.
I mean, there are plenty of, as we know, apes go to war and commit genocide, but
yeah.
So we're not totally unique. But I think that there is a certain uniqueness in our intelligence, of course, but also in using that intelligence for both collective good and collective evil.
That sometimes consciously and sometimes unconsciously.
Yeah, exactly.
And especially when if you say evil, almost all evil people will say, "I'm not evil. I'm great." So even if it's not, if it's they're doing what they're doing consciously, sometimes they're unconscious of its evil or its ill benefit. But go ahead.
But the obvious thing, of course, is that we believe that we're pretty much the only conscious things on this planet. You can argue that there are degrees of consciousness to other animals or systems or things like that, but as far as we know, we're pretty unique in the ability to at least self-reference, and the sentience that we feel seems to be, at least in a subjective way, unique. So it's an interesting thing that we have, and the fact that we can recognize it ourselves and recognize it in other people, and because of that feel some kind of connection with them, sometimes even a wish for preservation on them, is historically probably a stabilizing force, at least for those that we know are no threat.
Yeah, and that goes down to the social interactions with even animals. How you see some animals are more ruthless than others, and then some, they will know that they need to let the smaller rats win, or they know that they need to let the not kill the defeated wolf, or and it's apes have a more diverse behavior pattern, especially with all the different kinds of apes and chimps and gorillas and such things. And some of them are more ruthless and some are more caring and all those different kind of things. And so now
that's maybe something else, right? Which is that element of capability for us to project and to empathize.
Yeah.
It's hard to understand if other animals ever were to do that. We like to think that some of our pets can do that with us, that they understand what we're going through and whatnot, whether that's projection or actuality. I don't know if that's difficult.
Well, we have more mirror neurons, which is basically the empathy neurons, in that we can make that connection. And then what we do in that is we will look at the other person usually, and sometimes we do this looking into nature, and we will try to emulate it, whether it's some type of thing in nature or an animal. But then for the most part, it's that what we've developed in our copying each other and connecting to each other as that we've learned things, because we had to teach each other forever and ever of how to make the tools and affordances that we have, and then we copy each other, and that's through mirror neurons, and which develops that higher level of empathy,
and also develops ritual, by the way.
Yeah. So all those things. Anyway, so the other point that I was trying to get at, and that we won't totally today, but we will throughout this little series, is that what all this stuff does, especially now in our super complex reality that we're in, is it gets into, it's just so hard to tell what reality is. And I talked about it a bit in the most recent podcast with McCall, that especially now with like the media not always telling us what reality is, and they want to put their own spin on it for the media's benefit, not necessarily even a political benefit. Our environment isn't a physical environment like it once was per se. It's more of a psychological environment, and people have a lot of issues nowadays because they don't know what that environment is and what they're supposed to do in it. And so that's a lot of our struggle now that we're going through, and we need to try to help each other do better at that.
Yeah, I would like to add. I would like to see a reaction by me saying some kind of humans are different because we reach higher frequencies, and maybe like in some kind of chakra.
Oh,
different kind of chakras
Groovy, man.
Groovy, bro. That see well, where that does go,
I would never use that language.
Yeah,
but...
the language. Okay, the language is tricky. Although that kind of gets into, I talked about it a little bit in that other book that I'm just finishing, that I won't normally go into 9 or 10 podcasts on, but it's foundational to the cognitive map. But I think it was the individuation chapter of Jung's Map of the Soul talked about levels of consciousness. And so, and it wasn't just the way that we think of IQ and some of these things that we've been talking about today, but then he's talking about how there's the level of just like a survival Neanderthal, and also the level of a child up to an adolescent, and then people believing in religious, what Harari might call fictions, and then the level above that, which might be the modern level. I think he calls it level 4 in the chapter of that book, chapter 8, is the level of people understanding the falseness in those fictions, that they are fictions. But then and they talked about it again in that chapter, where that kind of causes a lot of the reason that people seek out therapy. And to kind of get into some of the things that we talked about earlier, is that because we're so aware of all of the fictions in the world, and that like nothing's real, oh my god, that's like one level of consciousness. But then what they call in the book the postmodern level, which isn't a term that Jung uses, but it's the level beyond that, which kind of gets into these yoga principles, or you might call transcendental or transcendent principles, which is to find a more transcendent level beyond just like deeper levels of reality that you can only gain through
the unification within the whole.
Yeah, inner experience. And so
this
that's
is
my reaction.
Very similar to the integral spiral.
Yeah, very similar. Which is Ken Wilber. Maybe Goncalo might be interested in that too.
Yeah, I would like to. I've never really dwelt into.
If you just
Ken
to
Wilber.
start out, there's a really great interview with him with Rebel Wisdom, with Ken Wilber, and there's another few conversations that you can find with Doshin Roshi and him that are quite interesting from an integral Zen perspective. So, which is, I mean, these are all just semantics, but it's as far as the term like frequencies and energies and whatnot, I would never use those.
Yeah. Well, but it what that we're getting at is we have levels of consciousness, or maybe the best way to term it in a more concrete way is, let's say, levels of awareness, and that throughout these revolutions, as Harari calls them, we've gained new and more levels of awareness, not just because of what we have are born into us as far as genetically and what we're able to do in our just being able to be aware, but then also what's handed down to us culturally, and what we can just
mimetically,
what we can learn through our history and talking to people even like this. Our awareness is getting higher and higher and higher. And now it's almost like, because we have these super high levels of awareness, hopefully we use it for solving problems and doing good with, and not just like smoke weed and jerk off all the time, because that's what some people do, and not gonna necessarily
single bachelor caveman.
Yeah. That's some and that was a point that Jung made, and Stein brought up in that chapter, that in your daily life you'll see people at every stage in this. You'll meet Neanderthals on the street, or cavemen, you might say, and you'll also meet people that in their consciousness they're like people in the Middle Ages in the way that they're thinking, and you'll meet the modern and postmodern, and then in our day-to-day language we also think of it in terms of you meet somebody and they act like a baby, or they act like a child, or they act like a teenager, and then maybe some people, they always act like young men or young women. So they have these levels of consciousness, and this is like available to just about everybody, but then a lot of it gets into the meaning aspect. It's like, why do I have higher level of consciousness? What should I do with all this awareness? Hopefully it's for something for the better, not just like screaming in the street at how horrible people are or something. Because that's sort of the double-edged sword with it. There's good that comes of it, but then also some existential dread and such things.
It's very bizarre to think about what those same kind of psychotechnologies looked like in their prehistoric kind of unformed, unhewn form.
Yeah.
I mean, it's bizarre to even think about what that development process was.
Yeah.
I mean, there is something in Maps of Meaning that he lays down how different practices become ritualized and eventually consecrated and so on and so forth. And there's a whole pathway, but I mean, it is very speculative, but it's a very interesting speculation. So yeah, it's weird that you can tap into those things, and potentially all through most of human history, we were able to tap into those things. We've just kind of recently become so globalized and historicized that we are able to do it more efficiently now.
Nice.
Yep. All right, guys. Anything else? All right, we did it. We got through it all. We understand everything about the cognitive revolution. But again, the whole idea of these talks is to just help each other and those who might listen to better understand these nuances of deeper things like this. Just like we said with this book, it's one that can take super complex things like all of history and make it a little bit more readable, because I mean, it is hard to grasp the whole of history. Like, this is like a whole world history book that someone can read in a few hours and somewhat be, enjoy it and not be bored with it and get a lot out of it, compared to before, good books like this that go deep into all these things. It would be just bad history books that nobody wanted to read, and not really getting into these finer details of why it happened and what it means. So that's what we're getting at. And yeah, do you guys have anything else to say or add in goodbyes before we wrap it up on this overtime edition?
Just to wrap up on my end, if anyone wants to come on and discuss more, of course, come on next time. Especially because I'm probably not going to be available, because I'm going to be in thesis writing mode like crazy.
Okay.
But
sorry we took so much of your valuable time today.
No. This was a good break, so I appreciate it. But I'm dropping off the map in March. That's the plan. The other thing it would be that just I think, as far as further reading, of course, all of Harari's books can discuss this, but there are a few others that I would recommend. One from Camille Paglia called Sexual Personae, which the first several chapters summarizes beautifully much of this, and from a art historian perspective. And then, of course, Maps of Meaning. Of course, then there's also another interesting text from Steven Weinberg, who's a Nobel Prize winning physicist in quantum field theory, who he wrote a book called, I believe it's called To Know the World or To Understand the World. And he goes through the entire scientific revolution, basically from the ancient Greeks and before on, and talks about all of that psychotechnology development. So it's definitely an interesting history, no matter how early you start and no matter from whose perspective you're reading it from.
Yeah, and what do you say, Goncalo? And then we'll wrap it up. And your concluding thoughts. What's that?
You're all homo.
We're all homo. Although that's that's an interesting issue in that Harari made it, and well, he was saying that we are sapiens because there were originally other homos. There were the Homo. How do you say it?
Homo erectus.
Homo sapien sapien.
There was the Cro-Magnon man.
Yeah,
was on there.
Denisovan.
Yeah. Or Denisovan if you're British.
Denisovan. Actually, I think I had to go full Australian if I'm going to say that properly.
Yeah.
But and then there's Erectus, Denisovan. What was the miniature?
I don't know if that was just the dwarf or
it was something like this, but some dwarf were only about 3 feet high. Yeah.
Not, and we still have that in our DNA, but so in our DNA we have at least the dwarf DNA, the Denisovan, and the
Denisovan.
All right, and Neanderthal is in our DNA, and then there's others that have perished but are not in our DNA that we know of. Oh, the other one that I was going to add along these lines, it's more big and expansive, but read the history and stories of Will Durant, or a lot of it I put in a playlist on the YouTube channel. A lot of it you can get on just the audio reading on YouTube now for Will Durant's stories of philosophy and stories of different periods in history, which really helped me a couple years ago as I was trying to sort all this out, because it helps to have it in a story form, which is what Will Durant was trying to do. So that's the other thing for all you people who want to learn more about this stuff. All right, guys. Well, thanks for going in overtime with us. And I don't know if anybody listened this much, but if you did, give yourself a merit badge or something. Anyway, stay cool, stay archetypal, and thanks a lot, guys. Say goodbye.
Thanks so much.
All right.
Thanks, man.
Take care, guys. Bye.